Okay, great. So our next speaker will be Josh Tenenbaum, who's coming to us from MIT today, and he's going to tell us about building machines that learn and think like people.
Okay, great. Thanks to the organizers and the other speakers for an amazing conference. Thanks to all of you for staying to the end. Thanks to the many people who are in my group currently, who have graduated from our group and are elsewhere, and a number of faculty colleagues. All of these are people who are the key collaborators on the work you're going to hear. So the last talk was wonderful. So many of the talks were wonderful. The last one was a great setup in many ways, including those 4 different fields, including the challenge at the end about making that the bridge between what you might call like real AGI and true flexible human intelligence. I'm one of this maybe small number of people here who definitely raised my hand for AI and also for cognitive science. And for these purposes today, I'm willing to also call myself a neuroscientist. But fundamentally, I'm interested in making a bridge between the basic science of intelligence in the human mind and brain and the engineering of more human-like forms of intelligence in machines. And it's really motivated by this question that Greg raised, that Jan raised, that many of the speakers have addressed in some way. Why is it that we have all these useful pliers and wrenches, basically, AI technologies, but no real AI? What's missing? Why do we have to design each of these systems with a great team of brilliant engineers at Google or Facebook or other companies? Why don't we have something that, just like any of you, can learn each of these things? Maybe not to world-class level, but you can learn each of these things for yourself without having to be specially engineered. So what's missing? In our work, we're trying to understand that gap. And there's many things that are missing, but here's one. One that I think organizes a lot of the work that we're doing, and many of us, I think, are interested in here. What is that wrench? What are those pliers? From our point of view, these technologies, the machine learning methods that are driving so much of current AI technologies, especially in industry, and that includes deep learning, but not only, are basically tools for pattern recognition. And especially deep learning has pretty much killed pattern recognition as far as many of us are concerned. But intelligence is about so much more than that, right? It's about, in particular, modeling the world. So think of all the ways that we don't just see patterns in data, but we try to explain and understand what we see. We try to imagine things that we've never seen, but might want to see. Actual things, not just cool object-like textures, but actual things. And then how do we make plans and solve the problems needed to make those things real? And then how do we build new models as we explore and learn more about the world? So this is the perspective that if you want to read a lot more about this BBS paper with Brendan Lake, Tomer Ullman, and Sam Gershman on building machines that learn and think like people really explores this in probably way too much length. I think, and just to be honest, again, all of us I think are interested in honesty here, that we are far from, and much as Greg said, we are far from having understanding the human ability to build models so flexibly and richly as we do, in engineering maturity that, say, Silicon Valley looks for. But at the same time, I think there are some roots, and in particular, the root that I'm arguing for, and this is in my own work and also in larger groups that I'm part of at MIT, such as the Center for Brains, Minds, and Machines, and the MIT Intelligence Quest, which Jim DiCarlo talked about, and I'm very glad to have him and Leslie Cabling, my other MIT colleague who's here, and Shimon Ullman, who's part-time with us at MIT, all part of all of this. Our view is that by studying how intelligence works in the mind and brains, especially of humans, but also of other animals, because there's many questions you can't ask in human brains, that it is both a route towards better understanding ourselves and to engineering the next generations of especially increasingly and more truly intelligent kinds of engineering AI technologies. Since we're all thinking here about history, here's one view of the history of the basic math of what we now call deep learning and reinforcement learning. These are some of the papers that publish the basic math of backpropagation, of course, but also just perceptron learning, reinforcement learning, temporal difference learning, deep convolutional networks, probabilistic neural networks, the first ones, Boltzmann machines. Terry's name is on there, unfortunately, on the bottom of the screen. You can't see it, but it's very importantly there. Or some of the first recurrent neural networks. And the reason to put these papers up there is I just want to draw your attention to when and where they were published. Right? They were published in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, so long ago, and mostly in journals of psychology and some biology. Okay? These are people who were, they might have been, some of them are psychologists, some of them were engineers or physicists or mathematicians, but they were all motivated by trying to understand the basics of human learning. And each of these at its time was a very simple first small step. But what we've seen in history over and over again is that good small steps, when scaled up with the maturity of engineering, can be huge, and they can transform our world. So think what could be next if we make the next, even small steps towards really understanding how human learning works. So in our work, and this is where I'm looking towards the next 10 years, this is my big moonshot goal here, and we have a nice, cool, fancy-looking slide that the MIT Intelligence Quest branding people put together for us. It's very nice. So this is a cool thing. You can see this on the website. But the pictures are theirs, but the words are mine. Imagine if we could build a machine that grows into intelligence the way a human being does, that starts off like a baby and learns like a child. That would be amazing. It would be a machine learning that really learns. It would be artificial intelligence that in some form was really intelligent. Okay? The other people here besides me are my colleagues, Rebecca Sachs and Laura Schultz. And I think it's also important to add my colleague, Liz Spelke, who, since she works at Harvard, the MIT people didn't put her on there. But she's probably the most important person on this slide. The three of them are, in some ways, developmental psychologists. Spelke studies infants behaviorally mostly. Rebecca Sachs studies infants and older children behaviorally and especially neurally. And Laura studies mostly older children learning, mostly behaviorally. And we collaborate richly with computational models and experimental studies, both behaviorally and neurally. So we're all working together on this, but we're certainly not the first people to work together on this, okay? And I should say Shimon is also a key part of this. Like, a bunch of us are really quite interested in this problem. It's probably the oldest good idea in AI. So Alan Turing proposed it in the same paper in 1950 when he proposed the Turing test, probably basically the first paper on AI. His only solution he could come up with for solving the Turing test was something like this, right? How do we build an adult-like intelligence? Well, nobody has any idea. Maybe it would be easier to start with a baby and sort of teach it like the way you teach a child. Marvin Minsky proposed this idea, John McCarthy, basically all of the great minds of AI at many different times. And there's a good reason for that, because when you look out at the universe, at least at the known universe, this is the only known scaling route to actual human-level intelligence, right? The only system that starts off knowing much less than an adult human and pretty much reliably, reproducibly comes to know what a human adult knows and be able to use that knowledge like a human is a baby. So we ought to understand it. Now, if it was that easy, we might have solved it, right? Why is this so hard? And why do we think we can actually make progress on this, say, over the next 10, 20 years, right? Basically the rest of my career. Well, I think it's because it's only now that the fields of both AI and cognitive science, and especially cognitive development, are mature enough to basically be able to talk to each other, all right? And hopefully listen to each other. Here's a way to think about it. Cognitive scientists, especially developmental cognitive scientists like the several colleagues I showed you, are fundamentally interested in these questions. These are the basic questions of any account of learning. How do you start and how do you grow, right? What is the form and content of the initial state or the inductive bias, and what are the mechanisms of learning? And what I think we've learned over the last couple of decades is really quite non-trivial and very different from what Turing and many people in AI have supposed and continue to suppose. Okay? So Turing said here, just to highlight the last words, how does a child work? He could only presume, okay, because nobody really knew. And it turns out he presumed wrong. He said, presumably the child brain is something like a notebook as one buys it from the stationers. Very little mechanism, lots of blank sheets. Okay? But Spelke famously has shown in studies of the youngest children that you can study empirically. Like, for example, this is a paper modestly called The Origins of Knowledge, but that's actually what it's about. These are two of the very most important papers on intelligence ever published. Okay? She studied the basic object perception and intuitive physics of 2-, 3-, and 4-month-old babies. Jan referred to some of this before, and she showed that, for example, understanding of object permanence, solidity, that things don't just disappear, wink out of existence, teleport, or don't pass through other solid things. That seems to be present in infants as young as you can look. And also 3D and occlusion. That same stuff works when an object drops behind an occluding screen. On the other hand, gravity doesn't seem to be present at 2 or 3 months and takes another month or a couple of months to kind of really have the same strong expectations. Here's an example of a paper from Rebecca Sachs, recently published just last year in Nature Communications, studying using functional brain imaging on babies who were 6 months old, 4 to 6 months, and now she's taken it down to 3 months, showing that the kind of uh, computational architecture, I mean, as much as you can really get that from fMRI, but the kind of things that you've seen, for example, in Jim DiCarlo's talk and several of the other speakers, that in some form, that circuitry of the high-level visual system in the ventral stream already seems to be there as young as you can look. It's also not nearly as specific, functionally specific as it is in adults. There's a lot of tuning that goes on. But the basic architecture of the system in some form seems to be there. Or here's a paper from Laura Schultz studying older kids. These are old infants. And it's just one of many papers from her group and many others. You know, I'm just showing my friends and colleagues here, but they are representative of a much broader field. In Laura's work, for example, she studies ways that children, as they learn, explore the world in very creative, thoughtful ways. They try to understand, learning in a sense as a kind of thinking. It's sometimes called the child as scientist view. That children, like scientists, form theories, form hypotheses, try to understand even small amounts of data just the way a scientist can. Okay. So in sum, what I think we've learned, right, is that there's a lot more initial content than we might have supposed, some of it quite structured. And here's a couple of slogans that I'm going to introduce over the rest of the talk. And also, there's many more mechanisms. We certainly have supervised learning, error-driven learning, reinforcement learning. We know that's there in the brain, okay? But there's these smarter kinds of mechanisms. So what has often been called the child as scientist, or a more algorithmic version of it we've been exploring recently, which I'll just show very end at the talk, of what we call the child as coder. So in my work, I'm trying to understand how these things work in engineering terms. They pose significant challenges for neuroscience and AI, especially in the paradigm that a number of the speakers here have been exploring, because basically we don't know how to get these things to work in neural networks. Some of them seem to require other kinds of technology. Fortunately, AI is, as Greg showed in his Venn diagram, AI is big, and cognitive science is interested in that whole set as well as expanding it. So I'll just try to give you a taste of how we tackle this. So core cognition, or sometimes I call it the common sense core, includes a number of things, but the heart is this. Representations of the world, which again are present from very early ages, not just objects as patterns and pixels, but as actual physical things, three-dimensional things in the world. When we talk about intuitive physics, we mean the kinds of abilities that are going on inside this 1.5-year-old kid's head here when he plays with his toys or stacks up cups. So just watch what he's doing here as he constructs a tower. We don't have time to watch the entire video, but if you watch long enough, he's going to take all those cups and stack them all up, okay? And he's going to do it in part by stacking up two things and making a little stack and then putting that on a bigger stack of 3 to make an even bigger stack of 5, okay? Goals and sub-goals on these objects and composing them into larger objects. For all of you who either work in robotics or know about robotics, what he's doing right there is just insane by any robotic standard. Like, if we could get a robot to manipulate objects as intelligently as that 1.5-year-old, it would be amazing. Or this is now intuitive psychology. Consider this 1.5-year-old in the back there in one of these famous experiments by Felix Warneken, that's the tall guy, and Michael Tomasello, okay? He can watch somebody performing a novel action he's never seen before and figure out what he's doing, and then how to help him. So just watch here, watch what he does. Here's the best part coming up right now. When he looks up and makes eye contact and then looks down to his hands, okay? So if we could get a robot that could do that without being instructed, this is completely nonverbal, and the kid has never seen this before. That would be amazing, all right? So from an AI point of view, this is a great target for us, this like 1.5-year-old level of intelligence. Of course, there's a lot more, and I'm happy to talk in the question period beyond that, but that's what we're shooting for. It's also a great target for neuroscientists and those interested in canonical computations, at least if you're willing to grant what I'd call these canonical cognitive computations. Especially intuitive physics, you can see this in many other species. You can see this in other primates, like this orangutan here, who's, if you watch long enough, is going to assemble a stack of big Legos into quite a tall tower. You can see it in this mouse over there, who's doing some very creative, persistent, valiant kinds of object planning with that cracker. You can see it in the famous New Caledonian crows, okay? So I think that, to me, it's extremely interesting whether the machinery for, say, intuitive physics, understanding of the world in terms of objects evolved once, and then these are all just different manifestations of the same evolutionary lineage, or maybe it co-evolved, or in a convergent way, it evolved multiple times, like the camera-like eye. Either one would be interesting. But regardless, this is a research program. There have to be, I think, basic canonical computations in the brain, which are being used in some form in all of these species. So to understand that is a great quest that I think many of us could do well on. How do we do that? Okay, so in the work that I've been doing, I'll show you some of the tools. This won't be a very technical talk, but here are some of the tools. So one thing we do is we try to develop new AI programming languages, much like TensorFlow or Torch. Languages like that have been absolutely transformative for deep learning. Other kinds of languages are starting to be transformative for our ability to model these kinds of basic common sensibilities of young children and even other animals. In particular, we're interested in languages that we call probabilistic programming languages. Okay, and they have about as much to do with probability as neural networks have to do with neurons. Namely, they use probabilities in various ways, and it's sort of things that are kind of like approximations to probabilities. But really, think of these as languages for building models of the world and doing inference on these models that allow us to combine a number of the best ideas of that whole AI set in the Venn diagram, not all of which fit in today's deep learning. In particular, symbolic languages for representation. So if you remember back to Leslie Cabling's talk yesterday, the idea of logic as a representation language, not necessarily and probably not mostly as an inference mechanism, but as a way to represent big sets with small words. Very, very powerful, especially because you can have sets about sets or words about words in abstraction. But also the ability to deal with uncertainty in the world, so probabilistic inference, or at least approximate forms of probabilistic inference and maybe a few samples that you can manipulate. And also hierarchical models. So if we want learning to learn, or if we want flexible inductive biases, I'll talk more about that at the end. If we want inductive biases that are strong, yet also can be reshaped and rewritten, which I think is central to human intelligence, the hierarchical structure of probabilistic programs is very valuable. And last but not least, neural networks. So increasingly, state-of-the-art probabilistic programming languages are also incorporating, let's say, for example, state-of-the-art deep learning languages like PyTorch. Okay. So this is becoming a very powerful tool set. Now, in our work, to capture some of this common sense core, we find it very helpful to define these probabilistic programs over some very interesting kinds of, let's say, data structures and algorithms, software tools that were developed in the game industry, known as game engines or video game engines. So for those of you who don't know, I bet many of you have even used these at this point. Game engines are a toolkit that allow a game designer to make a rich interactive experience for a player without having to program everything from scratch, without having to program fast, real-time interactive graphics or physical object interaction. Game engines often have AI planning tools, what's called game AI, which are very simple ways of having non-player character agents in the game. And I think, and some people find this compelling and some people find this crazy, but I think it's not among all the crazy hypotheses out there, it's not a bad one to explore. That the kinds of representations and algorithms in game engines provide a first approximation, a very rough first approximation, to the kinds of cognitive architecture for, say, intuitive physics, intuitive psychology, that evolution has built into our brains, and maybe the brains of many other animals. So in some of our group's work, this is work that started with Peter Battaglia and Jess Hamrick, both now at DeepMind and Matt Botvinnik's group, the neuroscience group there. We've used these tools to build a model of what we called the brain's intuitive physics engine. And we tested it in a number of ways. So we asked people, here I'll show you just a set of tests that we did in the first paper, which was this 2013 paper, in various kinds of blocks world scenes. So we would show people stacks of towers like these Jenga blocks here and say, how likely is it that this tower will fall? And what I'm showing you is example data from an experiment where people would judge 60 different stimuli like these a bunch of times so we could get some reasonable precision. Okay. And then we found that models which did a small number of probabilistic simulations in one of these game engines provided a pretty good, not perfect, but pretty good quantitative account where the towers that people thought were more likely to fall, so did our models. The same kind of account, though, can handle a whole range of questions. Okay. There really is no limit to the number of questions. The way we program the system to answer these questions the same way you program your brain, which is by taking a question in language and putting it into a formal query for a probabilistic programming language. So we can ask, which way will they fall, or how far will they fall? We can ask, or we can tell you, suppose the gray material here is 10 times heavier than the green stuff. How does that change which way the blocks will fall? Or take these scenes where they might seem surprisingly stable. If I tell you that either the red or the yellow material could be 10 times heavier than the other, can you tell which is heavier? or weird judgments like this, like if let me just illustrate this here. So I'll just do one demo just to help us wake up a little bit at the end of the day. And this is literally a demonstration of an experiment that we've done if you haven't been in behavioral experiments like this. So I show you a scene like this, and I say, suppose I knock the table hard enough to knock some of the blocks onto the floor. Is it more likely to be red or yellow blocks? So you guys tell me, red or yellow? Okay, here. Okay, good. So how did you do that? Right? You did it very quickly. Sometimes you were a little bit slower. Some of them are harder. Sometimes there was unanimous agreement. Sometimes there was some uncertainty. That's the kind of data that we work with in our field. And we have a model that can capture it. So this is just showing similar correlations between the average judgments that people like you made and the model. The model is basically exactly the same model as the one that does the Jenga blocks things. Okay? There's no learning here. There's just a little bit of programming through language. Okay? How does it work? It does things like this. So here's a simulation in a game engine of a small bump of one of these tables, and here's a larger bump. But the key is, it doesn't really matter which of these bumps you did. The language doesn't specify, right? You could do either one, okay? You don't have to run the simulation with high accuracy or more than a couple of time steps to see what's going to happen, right? You just run a few time steps, and you can just tell that it's going to be the yellow blocks. So that's at least some window of how a small number of fast, approximate simulations can give a rough probabilistic guess that isn't perfect for predicting the future state of the world, especially there's imperfections introduced by the fact that the game physics aren't real physics. But it's enough for the grain of common sense. And we think, for example, if robots could have this common sense and integrate it with learning and planning, as Leslie Cabling talked about, it would be quite amazing. The same kind of idea underlies what we call our intuitive psychology engines. Okay? So here, we kind of embed physics in this because we're talking about making inferences by psychology about the beliefs and desires or the goals and the world models that an agent has in very simple cases when they say move themselves around the world or move other objects around, okay? Or move themselves to get objects. So for example, look at this scene here. You're going to see a slightly slow motion video of a woman reaching for one of 16 objects on the table. Raise your hand when you think you can tell which object she's reaching for. Okay, so a bunch of people, you sort of thought initially, and then there was a little revision, right? So this dashed line there is actually, it's not behavioral data, that's our model predictions. We're currently doing experiments to test this, but it roughly seems to be like what people do. How does the model work? Well, it runs a small number of simulations where it assumes very much basically the model of motor control that Daniel Wolpert and his colleagues have developed over many years, and the whole field, that when it comes to reaching for things, we move in basically optimal ways, okay? And here the idea is that people know this. There's some evidence that even in a proto form, even 3-month-olds, this is from Spelke's lab, it's unpublished, and we can talk about it later, but in some form, this is either built into your brain, not just optimal rational reward cost-benefit trade-offs in your own motion, but the understanding of other humans' actions in that way. It's either built in innately, or it's learned as one of the very first building blocks of the whole rest of how we understand action. The same kinds of ideas can be extended with recursive multi-agent models, where agents can have beliefs and desires or goals and models about other agents' goals and models. And that allows you to look at a scene like this and see that one person has a goal and another person has the goal to help them. Or this scene over here, where it's not helping, but something kind of different, hindering, as we call it. So we think that this is the kind of models of our intuitive social sense sitting on top of our intuitive physics that will be necessary to understand what's going on even in that young kid's mind over there. All right. Now, excitingly, in the last few years, we've taken these ideas and actually used them to build some of the first quantitative models of infant intuitive physics and intuitive psychology. So we use scenes like this. This is from Luca Bonatti's lab in studies of Erno Teglis to study babies' intuitive physics, these objects bouncing around in a little lottery machine. We built some of the first quantitative models of the phenomena that Jan described, that infants, when they're surprised, they look longer. And we showed that that correlates with basically the inverse probability in our probabilistic physics simulation model. Or here's some very recent work, again, from Spelke's lab. It was done by Sherry Liu, an amazing student with Liz, and also with Tomer Ullman. See if I turn up the sound here. It helps to have sound. So this, for this one. Can you guys hear that? I can hear it. So here we study intuitive psychology, where basically infants see an agent who's willing to pay different amounts of costs to visit different agents. Sometimes the cost could be jumping over a wall. It could also be rolling up or down a hill of different slopes. It could be jumping over a gap, okay? And it doesn't really matter. Just like you, infants seem to see that an agent who pays a bigger cost to get to another agent probably wants that goal more. So that's just sort of inverse planning through this reward cost model. Okay. Even these recursive helping-hindering models have been used to explain and actually motivate new kinds of experiments done in collaboration with the developmental psychologist Kylie Hamlin, who's one of the world's leading experts on infant social evaluation of other agents. Again, all in 10-month-olds. And there's brains here too. So here's a set of studies that have been done, some with my collaboration, this one, and some that I'm just a cheerleader for. This is all work from Nancy Kamwischer's lab at MIT. This was done by Jason Fisher, who's now at Johns Hopkins, where we looked for some evidence of what we called the brain's physics engine. We gave people fairly, tightly controlled stimuli of tasks like, for example, physical prediction. What you see here is you see these dots moving around. One of them will disappear and then reappear 2 seconds later, and you have to say, did it appear in the right place? And here, it's a 2-second prediction task, and the contrast is between a physical stimuli and a social stimuli, where there's like a chasing or fleeing interaction. Or here, you have to make a judgment of like, will the tower fall versus to the red or green side, or are there more blue or yellow? Okay, and these and a number of other intuitive physics tasks seem to pick out a brain network that is not a novel one. In fact, Kenji Doya talked about it, and several of the other speakers talked about it too. It seems to be roughly a network of brain regions in the premotor cortex and the parietal cortex that have often been cited as action planning networks. Again, also Emo Todorov was mentioned, I think, by Kenji. He has argued for a number of years, and so have other people in robotics, that a humanoid robot or animal, or 4-legged animals too, in order to plan their actions, using basically a physics engine is what you want to do. I see that I'm running a little bit short on time, so I will say there's also a social area, and machine translation works really well too. Finding intuitive physics in the brain is interesting for neural computation, because there actually are a lot of neural network models at this point, and we learned something about inductive bias. So for example, there's some very cool models, first done by Sutskever and Hinton 10 years ago, and done it by Adam Lehrer and colleagues at Facebook, which try to do some of these intuitive physics tasks without building in object representations. And they work, but not nearly as well as machine translation. They don't really work that well, honestly. They don't generalize very much, and they require lots of training data. But there's been a new generation of models, some from DeepMind, some from our group, some from Jürgen Schmidhuber's group. This is a slide due to Michael Chang, who worked on a number of these projects, some from Jitendra Malik's group at Berkeley, which all involve basically kinds of recurrent neural networks, LSTM type networks, which are built on a basic symbolic representation of objects and their interactions, okay? I'm happy to talk more about this later, but I think it's at least practical empirical evidence that from an engineering point of view, building in a notion of discrete symbolic objects really helps neural networks learn physics. But of course, that raises a challenge. How do these work in the brain? Okay? It's a basic challenge for those of us who grew up reading the PDP books for the idea of distributed representations, which is what was reflected in the previous slide. I'll skip this other cool stuff. And I just want to end for the last 2 or 3 minutes on the problems of learning, okay? So one problem of learning is what I just showed in neural networks, but think about the bigger problem, okay? If you have something like a physics engine in your head, how does it get there? If it's something like a program, and learning is itself an algorithmic activity, if we have a learning algorithm, then that learning algorithm has to be like a program learning program. How could that work, okay? You can think of gradient descent as one such algorithm. But it's a very big question how you could get something that could actually learn like a physics engine. And could it actually match something, if you give it the same experiences that an infant has, could it match something like the developmental timeline? Jan showed a version of this before. This is again from Spelke's work and Bayer-Jean and others in the infant physics literature. We like to call this the hard problem of learning because in contrast to the at least easier problem of learning in, say, neural networks or other end-to-end differentiable systems, right, there isn't a smooth optimization landscape where you can just roll downhill. The landscape of programs, if you're searching through the space of programs, is ridiculous. And somehow we need a way, and somehow children have a way of searching it. Or maybe, I think, again, as many speakers have said, it's really some combination of evolution and child development that have a way of searching through this. A lot of the work is probably done by evolution. But there is definitely a lot done by learning. And so, I talked about before this metaphor of the child as scientist very briefly. What we've been exploring right now, and this is just frontier work in our group, is the idea of learning as programming, or you could call it the child as coder. So think about all the ways that when you write code, you change it to make it more awesome. So one of the ways you do that is by running a gradient descent algorithm, right? That's tuning parameters. But there's all sorts of other ways that involve actually writing new structure for code. And we need to, I think all of these have analogs in children's learning, and we need to learn them. There's work that we started doing. This is some of Brendan Lake's work that was already talked about here, and many people know it, so I'm not going to go into it here. But the work we did on learning handwritten characters, the reason why we did this was because it was an early kind of program learning. And what we argued is that you could understand human one-shot learning of concepts by having programs which generate the characters and then working backwards with a Bayesian inference algorithm to learn what those programs were from even just one example. And that could match human-level performance. Here's one of our simple Turing tests, right? Can you tell which of these sets of characters was generated from our algorithm versus other humans who were asked to generalize from one example? And most of you probably can't tell. All right. Neural networks have been developed to try to do this, and there's been some very nice successes. But still, if you look closely at any one of these, there's many flaws because they don't have enough symbolic program structure. At least that's our conjecture. Or another thing that was already mentioned were problems like, for example, in our Frostbite challenge. How can you learn to play a game like this, not in hundreds of hours, okay, but maybe just in 10 minutes? Well, we're working on that. I was very inspired by Matt's talk about this, where he said, basically by combining recurrent nets and multitask learning, you could, someday he thinks we'll be able to solve that. They don't have Frostbite yet. He gave this nice empty set thing to say, basically, you don't have to add anything to the current toolkit other than multitask learning. We think that when you look closely at the results, which are impressive, this is some of their transfer results on DeepMind Lab. The key is to look at the x-axis, which is 10 billion frames. They can accelerate. The first billion frames are basically still the same. And what we're interested in is what's going on far before the first billion frames, more like the first couple hundred frames. And we have a model of this. This is work that Pedro Civis is doing is in progress. And we can sum it up by saying that it is not equal to the empty set, but it does involve kinds of program induction and pretty cool kinds of what we call model-based curiosity, where you're actively planning to explore to fill in the gaps in your models of the world. And this lets us actually capture how people learn simple video games in just a few hundred time steps. And the last thing I'll leave you with is just looking forward. We all are here with blue sky speculation. And for me, I'm interested in, is it possible that these kinds of ideas could scale up to include all the things that a child learns over her lifetime in her daily life? And the current idea that we're exploring is that maybe, especially if you think that the learning doesn't just go on during the day, but at night. And here I'm inspired by several of the talks that people already gave here about what's going on in sleep and learning in sleep, but also the original idea of the Helmholtz machine and the wake-sleep algorithm, for those of you who remember this. So we've been working on a kind of wake-sleep learning for programs, and it's doing some pretty cool stuff. I'll just say stay tuned, and I think this is just one of many interesting developments that are going to be taking our field and the intersection between AI and neuroscience to exciting new places over the next few years. This is my conclusion slide, which is canonical computations. I just want to leave you with the idea that we want to think about canonical computations in brains, minds, and machines. And I think that by thinking about the canonical computations in minds that cognitive scientists have been getting at, that can actually lead to a better bridge between the computational neuroscience world and the AI world. Because it poses challenges for us, right? We say, well, okay, we've got these ideas of like probabilistic programs and game engine programs for intuitive physics, or we've got these things like model-based curiosity and program induction. Most of these we don't know yet how to do in neural networks. But I showed you a little bit of progress people are making. And I think it gives us insights and challenges, right? It leaves us with the challenge of how might these work in the brain. And it leaves us with an insight, which I just want to leave you with this thought, and then feel free to ask questions if you're interested. But this issue of inductive bias, I was very taken by what Upi said before, at the end of his talk at the end of the last session, which is that just because something is innate or genetically programmed or hardwired doesn't mean it's inflexible. In fact, if what's wired in is a computational system, then that might be the key to our flexibility, okay? So I think we need to be able to think about that kind of idea, or how might symbolic structures be as learnable, or maybe even more learnable, as, say, an end-to-end differentiable program. These are some of the challenges for us going forward as a field. So if you're excited about any of these challenges on the neuroscience side, or ways this might lead to actually more intelligent forms of machines, then I truly hope that you'll join us. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much for that beautiful talk. We do have time for some questions. For Upi?
So Josh, that was really cool. I have a question. Do you have a parallel between your proposed physics engine in the child and the language engine, which is also an extraordinary expression of, I think, pre-programmed ability to learn language?
Yes, I think that's a great question. I think that language is often talked about as the consummate symbolic activity, whereas intuitive physics has sometimes been studied as sort of thought of by psychologists as an analog process of mental imagery. I think, as game physics engines show, and the probabilistic programs we wrap them in, I think to model intuitive physics, you need a really interesting hybrid of symbols and numbers. And probably that's, now we'd say that's probably true for language too, like probabilistic grammars. So I think that the kinds of general tools, canonical computations really in the engineering sense that we're working out here will be useful for language. But the reason why I'm not focused on language right now is a number of them. I think right now we have physics engines. We actually have them, okay? We don't have language engines. What Chomsky called the infinite use of finite means, which is the magic of human language that allows you to make sentences that you've never made before and understand them when someone else utters them. We have that already. We don't have any machines that really do that with real meaning, but we have that already with these game physics engines where they have real semantic content that physicists will tell you, yeah, that's right. Okay, so I want to get that first, and then we'll do the next one. And also developmentally, language builds on this stuff. So I think the reverse engineering can follow that same route. But yeah, I hope that's where we'll be going for too long.
Question?
I have a question about the toys the children were playing with.
Yeah.
And watching them take very simple things like cups and blocks and using those to learn the physics of the world. I wonder how much of this is sort of gender bias, that they don't give little girls those kinds of things. They tend to give them dolls.
Well, this girl did some of that, but this is actually Laura Schultz's daughter. But you're right. Certainly there's a lot of gender, let's just say, gender probabilities that seem to be there in the toy industry and how parents treat kids, and possibly in how kids work. I think that the world of toys, physical objects, this isn't about boys versus girls. It's not about humans versus monkeys or birds. The idea that the world is made out of objects that are enduring entities is the oldest thing in our evolutionary landscape, and distinctively in the human part of the evolutionary landscape, I would say, and I think Spelke would agree, that really where toys come from is tools. Humans have used tools, boys have used tools, girls use tools. We are a consummate tool-using species, and I think the architecture of the brain that supports these intuitive physics comes from planning your own motions, planning your body's motions, and how your body manipulates objects. And I think that the study of kids playing with toys is a fertile one, regardless of maybe some unfortunate gender biases.
So building on the idea of an intuitive physics,
Yeah.
do you think there's an intuitive object understanding as well? Or do you think that's more learned through experience?
Well, what do you mean by object understanding? I think this is one part of object understanding, but what do you mean? Yeah.
Well, so the data that you showed, demonstrating really young babies have a fairly extensive knowledge of physics, is inherent to that understanding the fact that they must understand objects as well in order for them to understand that physics?
Yeah, well, okay, so to me, yeah, I think there's many things we could, here I'm just going back to that time, that this slide if people want to look at this. So there's many things we could mean by understanding objects, right? Some of you, if what you're used to thinking about is object recognition, like the stuff that Jim DiCarlo has studied and what a lot of machine vision has studied, you may be a little bit confused because I'm not talking about that, right? So certainly one part of object understanding is what we might call semantic labels for kinds of things. And again, that's also deeply linked to tools, okay? But here I'm talking about an understanding of objects, which is, yeah, an object as an enduring physical thing. When we talk about object permanence,
Yep.
we mean like, okay, you know, I have this thing in my pocket, even if you'd never seen a phone before, right? Like if we had somebody from the Stone Age, this was not a thing then, but they can see it and suddenly they can realize it's a thing, okay? They can even start to form a category on it. But what the developmental research shows, which is really quite striking, is that long before kids do the things that have been considered more basic in machine vision, namely attaching labels to things, they do this. Much earlier, they see objects as these enduring physical entities that can be manipulated, that can causally interact with other objects like collision dynamics, and that they can causally manipulate. And other animals do too. The orangutan doesn't know what a Lego is or doesn't know what the word means. Okay, the crow probably doesn't know about categories of tools, but they can look at these things and see what they might be able to do with them. So I think we need an understanding of objects which includes all of these different dimensions. And I think when we really understand how this works in the brain, a lot of what we now call object recognition pathways, we will characterize them differently. And a lot of what we call association cortex or multisensory cortex, we will also characterize it differently. I think we will characterize it as part of this integrated object understanding system.
Okay, great. Well, let's thank Josh again.